What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, July 23rd edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have an 11-game MLB slate tonight. Doesn't look like we have any major weather concerns, but we do have a lot of games that potentially could have weather concerns by the time we get there. It seems like there's a lot of rain around the games generally, but nothing that looks too concerning right now. So that's something we'll have to keep a little bit of an eye on. But for now, I don't think it's anything that is going to matter, at least for the purposes of today's show. Stephen Leibowitz said, in honor of Sean V, I want to point out it is Don Drysdale's birthday today, so he looks good against the Giants. Perfectly valid Sean V level take right there. So as always on this show, going to just go game by game, talking about what looks like the best plays. I'll try and touch on some overarching strategy, but definitely we'll get more into tournament strategy in my 5 o'clock tournament show, as I've been doing. If you are watching this back later and you're trying to see my thoughts on a specific game, you can follow along using the banner up here at the top. Whichever game is highlighted is going to be the one that I'm talking about. So going to start with the Mets and the Yankees in Yankee Stadium. Park upgrade for Mets bats, park downgrade for their pitching. Luis Gil going for the Yankees, Jose Quintana on the mound for the Mets. Gil getting about 16% ownership, 14% chance of being optimal in my numbers. He's a really good strikeout pitcher. He walks too many guys, nearly a 12% walk percentage this year. It's not the best strikeout matchup against the Mets, who ranked 20th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. It is obviously a difficult park to pitch in. All that stuff working against Gil, but he is also $9,000 and has a 28.2% strikeout percentage this year. Very big boom or bust spot here, I think, given Gil's ability to get strikeouts, but also his tendency to be working behind the counts. He can get himself in trouble that way. Obviously, it's not always just walks. If you're working frequently behind in counts against good hitters, you can get into trouble as far as home runs go as well. That hasn't been much of an issue for Gil so far this season, but this is a Mets lineup that has a lot of power. They have a 115 WRC plus against right-handed pitching on their active roster so far this season. So it is a dangerous spot, but pitching on this slate isn't great. There are some good pitchers for sure, but Gil does have one of the higher strikeout percentages. So I understand why the ownership is where it is. Quintana on the other side, very, very, very difficult sell for me. Not getting any ownership, but he's $7,900 going up against a Yankees team that is pretty difficult to strike out. Quintana himself is not great at getting strikeouts. So far this season, only striking out about 18% of hitters, 4.39 xFIP, 1.5 home runs allowed per 9 innings, and now he's pitching in Yankee Stadium. I think it's a pretty clear, for lack of a better word, cross off with Quintana here. Offensively, both of these teams are going to have at least some merit to me. The Yankees, you can see showing up a lot in all stack types, showing up right now as my most frequently used 5-man as well. It's just a pretty good matchup. You know, Quintana's not the worst pitcher in the world, but he has, like I said, allowed 1.5 home runs per 9 innings so far this season. He is getting a park downgrade here. Righties have a 191 expected ISO against him. Sets up as a great spot for Aaron Judge individually, although most spots do. DJ LeMahieu obviously sucks, but he is really cheap. Gleyber Torres is cheap. Soto, lefty. I don't really care. It's still Juan Soto in Yankee Stadium. Just looks like a good spot overall for the Yankees. Obviously, Aaron Judge is the priority, but then you get some value elsewhere. So you get a situation where you can get a very high upside stack that has a high implied run total in a good park for home runs, and then still have good pitching, good one-offs around that stack. So the Yankees make a lot of sense. The Mets aren't showing up as much for me, at least right now. And that's not surprising given that Gil is a better pitcher than Quintana. But I do still think that they're at least somewhat interesting in tournaments since Gil is getting some ownership. They are getting the positive park bump. Brandon Nimmo, 5,300 is expensive, but he's been playing really well. Francisco Lindor also playing really well of late. He looks like a good shortstop option. None of these guys are getting any ownership, which is interesting to me, just given, again, the park upgrade. I don't think that they are a huge priority on this slate. You know, you have 11 games, you have Coors Field, you do have a difficult matchup with Gil, but as far as upside at no ownership, I do think the Mets are kind of interesting. Tampa Bay facing the Blue Jays in Toronto. Tyler Alexander expected to be the bulk reliever for the Rays. Jose Barrios getting the start for the Blue Jays. Barrios looks like a secondary option here. About a 12% chance of being optimal, 9% ownership. Decent matchup against Tampa Bay. They are a top 5 strikeout team against right-handed pitching this year with a 25.1% K percentage. They have a 95 WRC plus. Barrios is like a perfectly average pitcher. So far this season, striking out not striking out as many guys so far this season as in previous seasons. Only striking out 17.8%, 4.53 xFIP. He's been below average this year. If you balance that out with what he's done in the past, I think he's just kind of average, but certainly struggling this year. And that's why you're seeing, modest ownership here in what would actually be a pretty decent matchup. It is also a park upgrade for Tampa Bay going into Toronto. So at 8,100, if you're playing a lot of lineups, I think Barrios looks okay here and there. If you're playing a couple lineups, probably not somebody that I would be getting to on this slate. Offensively, both teams do look pretty decent. This park is good for power, right-handed power specifically. We have basically kind of a bullpen game for Tampa Bay, which isn't the most appealing, but you do have a left-handed bulk reliever going up against a bunch of right-handed power bats for Toronto. Alexander has allowed a 235 expected ISO to right-handed hitters so far this season. For Barrios, he's actually allowed more power to righties than lefties so far. 204 expected ISO to righties, 166 to lefties, more expected power, I should say. His actual ISO allowed is higher to lefties, but you're going to get some pretty decent value, I think, from this Tampa Bay team. Isaac Paredes in a park, again, that plays up right-handed power, only 4,300 against Barrios. He looks good, getting some ownership. I don't think he's getting enough. Richie Palacios, second base outfield eligible, is cheap. He's not getting that much ownership. Brandon Lau is relatively inexpensive. Rosarena at 4,200. I like the spot for him against Barrios. In addition to allowing a lot of expected power this year, Barrios isn't getting a lot of strikeouts either. He only has a 15.8% K percentage against righties. I think it's a pretty interesting, pretty good spot to get to Tampa Bay, given the pricing and the park upgrade. And then on the other side, for the Blue Jays, it is a bit of a watered-down lineup since you don't have Bichette, but you do still have a $4,800 Vlad Guerrero. He did get third base eligibility back on DraftKings as well, which just makes it even easier to get him into lineups. Justin Turner is cheap. Danny Jansen is cheap. George Springer is not having a great year, but then he'll just break a slate every couple of weeks with 2 home runs and a double or whatever. So I think Toronto looks fine. They are getting a little bit more ownership than Tampa Bay, and Tampa Bay is actually grading out as the better team for me right now. So I do think that's interesting. But I think they're pretty comparable as far as chances of success. Upside is certainly there in this park. So I like getting to the offenses in this game. The Reds are facing Atlanta in Atlanta. Chris Sale pitching for Atlanta. Nick Martinez for the Reds. Nick Martinez had not been announced when I ran this, so I do not have him in. Chris Sale projected for 45% ownership. I think he's going over-owned, but still clearly the best pitcher on the slate. Showed up as optimal 22% of the time for me at $10,500. He is fantastic. He's probably the most talented pitcher on this slate. You do also have Garrett Crochet, but you have workload concerns with him. So Chris Sale, 32.4% K percentage this year, 2.52 xFIP. You get to face Ellie De La Cruz from his weaker side of the plate as well, which is nice. Cincinnati's active roster ranks 10th in strikeout percentage and has a 96 WRC plus against left-handed pitching since the start of last year. Sale looks really, really good. It's just a matter of finding value elsewhere and, how much can you get to him. I'm not overly concerned about his ownership here because it is still only one spot in my lineup. He does project really, really well. I think on an 11-game slate, it's going to be easy enough to just find low-owned bats that I want to get to and play a very popular Sale. So he obviously looks good. Nick Martinez, again, getting the start on the other side. I don't think he is going to be all that useful. He's 6,600. It is a pretty good matchup with Atlanta, given the injuries that they're dealing with. But Martinez most recently pitched on July 14th, so prior to the All-Star break, threw 11 pitches. Before that, 34, 25, 30, 23. I assume that over the last week or 10 days, he's thrown bullpens and gotten somewhat stretched out. But given how limited he had been working out of the bullpen, it would just surprise me if he is stretched out enough that I would actually want to roster him at $6,600 on an 11-game slate, despite the pretty good matchup against the Braves. Atlanta themselves look okay, but I don't really love getting to them here. Martinez isn't a terrible pitcher. The Braves lineup is just weaker than usual. You can see up at the top, they have a pretty high implied run total, but I do think that'll come down. I think that was partly a function of, at the time that I ran all of this, the Reds not having a confirmed starter in Martinez. So I'm not really all that interested in the Braves here. It's just tough to really like their lineup when they're missing Albies, they're missing Acuna, they're missing Harris. The lineup just gets a lot weaker. Cincinnati certainly not looking to get there against Sale. The Phillies are facing the Twins today in Minnesota. Had a good amount of Phillies yesterday. That game started out really well with the Bryce Harper homer, and then pretty much nothing else happened. Simeon Woods Richardson on the mound for the Twins today. Zach Wheeler for the Phillies. I don't really know why Woods Richardson is showing up as high as he is in optimal percentage right now. I think there's a good chance that changes as we get further along in the day, as there are more confirmed value bats in lineups. He is cheap at 6,200, but this matchup against Philadelphia is terrible. The Phillies are not a particularly easy team to strike out. They rank 19th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They have a 110 WRC+. They're one of the best teams in baseball. And it's not like Woods Richardson is a great strikeout pitcher or anything on his own. Striking out about 21% of hitters so far this year, 4.29 xFIP. And if anything, that strikeout percentage probably comes down going forward because he did have a string of favorable matchups that he took advantage of when he was first called up from AAA this year. He doesn't project as a very good strikeout pitcher. So again, I think he's showing up as a relatively high optimal percentage because of his price right now. But by lock, with 22 offenses going, you're probably just not really going to need to pay down for him. Zach Wheeler, on the other hand, certainly the more talented of these two pitchers. 9,500 is relatively expensive. The matchup against Minnesota is pretty average. 18th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 102 WRC+. Wheeler is very good, though. 27% K percentage, 3.46 xFIP. Like I expect Woods Richardson's optimal percentage to come down as we get confirmed lineups later in the day. I do think that you'll see Zach Wheeler's come up. And for that matter, I think Chris Sales will as well. Wheeler getting 26% ownership. Certainly the pitcher that I would expect to be prioritizing in this game. Offensively, the Phillies are not showing up as well as I expected. But again, that's probably in part a function of Woods Richardson showing up way more than I think he should be. As we get closer to lock, I think that the Phillies start getting easier to get to. They are an expensive offense, but as you get confirmed lineups with unexpected value elsewhere, it becomes easier to fit the Phillies in. Turner, Schwarber, Harper, Alec Boehm, all expensive. Real Muto, Stott, Castellanos, not exactly cheap either. So that's one reason that they're not showing up more. But it is a pretty nice spot against Woods Richardson. It is a park downgrade from a power standpoint. Lefties this year, 154 expected ISO against him. Righties have a 187 expected ISO. But again, you just have a lot of talent in this Philadelphia lineup. So if you are able to afford them, I think that they look pretty good. Looking at my pitch type model, Alec Boehm, Nick Castellanos, both grade out pretty well, which is in line with Woods Richardson having reverse splits as well. So I think they are interesting in addition to obviously wanting to get to Harper and Schwarber wherever I can. Not looking to get to the Twins against Zach Wheeler on an 11-gamer. The Brewers were relatively disappointing yesterday, but going up against the Cubs again today in Wrigley, Colin Rea for the Brewers, Jameson Taillon for the Cubs. Neither of these pitchers look particularly appealing. Neither one is cracking 10% in optimal percentage. Neither one's really getting ownership. 7,400 for Rea, 8,300 for Taillon. So it's not like you're getting a crazy amount of value on either guy. Neither one's a very good strikeout pitcher. 19.5% K percentage for Taillon this year, 17.2% for Colin Rea. I think they can pretty easily be ignored, especially if you're not playing 150 lineups. Nothing that looks like a priority as far as pitching goes. Offensively, it does look like a pretty good spot. Milwaukee showing up fourth most for me. The Cubs a little bit further down the list. Brewers showing up as the second highest frequency 5-man stack. They are still cheap given or compared to what they're normally priced at. They also still do have favorable positions. Willy Adames, 4,300 at shortstop, has some power, has some stolen base upside. Contreras at 5,100 at catcher. Yelich isn't cheap, but obviously is still good. Bryce Turang, still relatively inexpensive. So you're not getting much ownership right now, at least. You do still have pretty favorable pricing. The Brewers look pretty good to me here. I wouldn't be surprised if you do see their ownership come up a bit as the day goes on because of how well basically they are grading out. I think that you'll see the field probably adjust at least a little bit and start to get there as well. Colin Rea also not good at controlling the running game, so that benefits anybody fast on the Cubs. Jameson Taillon is pretty average, so that doesn't affect Milwaukee. For the Cubs, again, they're not showing up as much as Milwaukee, but there is some power here. You are talking about a pitcher in Colin Rea that doesn't miss a lot of bats. Righties this year only have a 158 expected ISO against him. Lefties are at 198. Unfortunately, most of the power for the Cubs right now does come from the right side. Morel, Swanson, Horner, Suzuki, all right-handed bats. You can look to Ian Happ. You can look to Michael Busch. There is pinch hit risk potentially on Busch, but the Cubs look okay here. Again, they can run a little bit as well, but the Brewers are my preferred side right now going up against Tyon. White Sox taking on the Rangers in Texas. Garrett Crochet pitching for the White Sox. John Gray on the mound for the Rangers. Crochet, I think, is pretty difficult to want to get to at this point. We don't know exactly how the White Sox are going to handle him. I haven't seen anything specific about his pitch count today. We know that the White Sox had said a month or so ago that they were going to be limiting him at some point in the future. Then specifically in his last start before the All-Star break, they said he would be limited, and he was even more limited than people were guessing. He went 2 innings. He threw 28 pitches. It's really hard for me to confidently say that he's just going to go back out there and throw 95 pitches today, especially when there's a pretty good chance this is his last start as a White Sox. There's really not a lot of reason for them to do anything risky, given that he's one of the most sought after trade pieces at the deadline. It's not, sometimes you'll see people bring up the narrative like, oh, well, they need to pitch him because, to showcase him. Every team knows what Garrett Crochet is. No team needs to see him throw 6 more innings to decide if they want to trade for him or not. So it's much more likely that the White Sox err on the side of caution here than that they, run him into the ground and give him a full workload. So he's showing up even more than I expect right now. This ownership number, I think, comes down. I think his optimal percentage comes down. Again, unless we get confirmation from the White Sox, and maybe it's possible we have and I missed it, but unless we get confirmation from the White Sox that he is just a full go, I don't really know how you pay $9,800 for this guy. Obviously, he's going to be good or you expect him to be good in whatever time he's out there, but it's an 11-game slate. He's $9,800. I have a really difficult time wanting to get to him unless it is specifically confirmed that he is not going to be limited here. John Gray on the other side looks pretty good at 7K. White Sox, obviously a very good matchup. Gray is a completely fine pitcher. Threw 20 pitches on the 19th, so that's a problem. That was in relief, though. I don't really know what to make of it. It was a non-competitive game against the Orioles. He just worked an inning out of relief. I assume that they're just using that basically as a throw day and that he's going to be back out there for 80, 85 pitches today, which at 7K would make him look decent. I don't expect him to go, or I'm not confident saying I think he goes really deep into this game, because if you look back to his starts prior to the All-Star break, July 8th, 78 pitches, July 3rd, 77 pitches, June 27th, 73, June 22nd, 72, 55, 65 in the starts before that. He hasn't thrown 80 pitches or more since May 15th when he threw 94 pitches. He went on the injured list, I believe, after his start on May 21st. So somewhere around 80 pitches, I would kind of think is some sort of a cap for him. That does keep him from looking better than he otherwise would, but I still think at 7K against the White Sox, assuming he can give you 75-ish pitches, I think that he is still reasonable, just not as big a priority as he otherwise would be. Offensively, I don't think that there's going to be a lot that looks good here. For whatever time Garrett Crochet is in the game, it's a brutal matchup for Texas. One thing I would say is that there's some angle to playing the Rangers, especially if we don't get confirmation on Crochet's workload, or if we do get confirmation that he's going to be limited again. The White Sox don't have a good bullpen. So you could get a situation where Crochet goes 2 or 3 innings. Nobody plays the Rangers because they're going against Garrett Crochet. And then you're just getting 6 or 7 innings of a below average White Sox bullpen. That certainly could happen here and would give you some upside at low ownership. But unless, other than thinking along those lines, it's tough to want to get to the Rangers. For the White Sox, Gray, a pretty solid pitcher. The White Sox, a really bad offense. They are cheap. I played them a good amount yesterday against Lorenzen. Gray is better than Lorenzen. From a weakness standpoint, he has had issues with left-handed power this year. 193 expected ISO allowed against lefties for Gray. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can really do with that information because Andrew Benintendi doesn't hit for any power, and everybody else on the White Sox basically is right-handed. Gavin Sheets, if he were in the lineup, would be kind of interesting. But overall, even though it's a good hitter's park, I think it's tough to want to get to the offenses here. Again, a full like 5-man Texas stack is kind of interesting, just with the idea that maybe Crochet only goes 2 innings again. Arizona facing KC in Kansas City. Looks like a pretty good game for offense based on the total here. Alec Marsh is pitching for the Royals. Jordan Montgomery is expected to return from the injured list for Arizona. He was not projected in when I ran everything. He has struggled a lot this year, so that's going to make Kansas City look pretty good. He's been just flat out terrible for Arizona. And then now you're also getting him coming back from the injured list. So I do like getting to Kansas City. Bobby Witt Jr., obviously a fantastic play as always. Alec Marsh, I don't really see any reason to get to him in a pretty difficult strikeout matchup against the Diamondbacks. So I think this is a game that is built more for offense than for pitching. Again, I like Kansas City against Montgomery. They'll probably show up a little bit more once I rerun everything with him as the confirmed starter, but they look pretty good. Bobby Witt, clearly the priority as usual. Salvador Perez looks good if you can afford him. But Kansas City stacks overall will look fine here as well. And your daily reminder that Kauffman Stadium is actually good for run scoring. It's good for offense. It's good for everything offensively except for home runs. Obviously, home runs are important in DFS, but Kansas City also sort of mitigates that by the fact that they have so many guys that can steal bases that it's not the end of the world if they're just getting on base and then stealing and getting there that way. Arizona looks pretty reasonable against Marsh as well. Again, a good park overall offensively. Marsh is a decent pitcher, but he has had power issues this year. Lefties have only struck out 19% of the time against him. 188 expected ISO. Ketel Marte, Corbin Carroll, both look good. Alec Thomas is cheap, assuming he's in the lineup. Jock Peterson has some power from the left side. And then righties have struck out 26.3% of the time, but they actually have a higher expected ISO against Marsh than lefties do. So don't sleep on Christian Walker. I like him quite a bit at 5,200. Gurriel looks pretty good at 4,200. I like offense in this game. Both sides of it look pretty good. Looking at my pitch type model, Ketel Marte grades out well against Alec Marsh, so I like that. Seems to be the guy that grades out the best in this game. Jock Peterson looks above average as well. So really like getting to both sides of this one. Arizona probably the preferred stack, but they do both look pretty good. Before we get into Coors Field, a reminder, if you haven't already signed up for Endgame Syndicate, you can do so using the link in the description below. It's a great time to do so. We have our end of the month roundtable coming up at the end of the month. It's for subscribers only. It's a live Q&A with Utica, Nerdy Tenor, Brick75, and myself talking about whatever you want, whatever you have questions about, process-wise, strategy-wise, whatever it may be within DFS. We do that for our members once a month. And you also, as a member, get access to Discord, where we are in there answering questions and talking. You get access to all of our training videos. We have a bunch up already. I've walked through my process and how I use SaberSim as someone that isn't advanced enough to have built my own set of tools. Brian has talked about some things he does in SaberSim and how to build your own projections, your own ownership projections. He has videos up on all of that. Nerdy Tenor has several video series out already on game theory aspects and how or why you should be approaching DFS in certain ways. Utica has videos out on his process, which is different than mine, different than Brian's, different than pretty much anybody else's that I've talked to. So you get him walking through what he does in Fantasy Cruncher and what he looks for as far as research day to day in baseball. He will have his videos for NFL coming out soon. So sign up, take advantage of all of that stuff. Best time to do it to get the best bang for your money would be soon so that you get access to the end of July Q&A. You can sign up using the link in the description below. Now moving on to Coors Field, we have the Red Sox taking on the Rockies. Ty Blach is pitching for the Rockies. Totally blanking on who's pitching for the Red Sox until this loads. Cooper Criswell for the Red Sox. Neither pitcher looks interesting here, but obviously, it's a game where you expect offenses. We played some Tanner Houck yesterday, but Cooper Criswell, not as good a pitcher. He is only 5,800. So if you had to pay down for pitching, he is viable. He's not a bad pitcher. It is a good matchup against the Rockies, but obviously this park sucks and you have plenty of other pitching options you can go to. Offensively, I expect this game to be very popular, Boston in particular, but we once again have the Red Sox going up against a left-handed pitcher in Ty Blach. We saw this yesterday. Ref Snyder pinch hit for. Westbrook homered, but was pinch hit for. Romy Gonzalez got the start, was pinch hit for. When the Red Sox face left-handed pitching as chalk, they are generally not a stack that I really want to get to, unless I am specifically targeting the guys that I know are not going to get pinched for. Duran, O'Neill, Wong, the actual regulars. Because Ref Snyder, like assuming we get the same lineup as we did yesterday, Ref Snyder is going to project as a good value. Westbrook's going to project as a good value. So is Gonzalez, point per dollar. But the problem is you're just very likely not to be getting your final at bat or two in this game. And so what ends up happening is people build their lineups. But even if you are adjusting your projection to account for pitch hit risk, like you should be, and like any good projection site is or should be, you're still not correctly capturing their potential distribution of fantasy points because, like, when you run a sim, it doesn't necessarily know that there's a really good chance this guy is only getting 3 at bats instead of 5 or stuff like that. So they do generally just tend to be overowned. So be careful with Ref Snyder, be careful with Westbrook, be careful with Gonzalez if they're in the lineup. If you were to, for some reason, get a Red Sox lineup that just has the lefties in there, you have Abreu starting, you have Dominic Smith starting, you have David Hamilton starting, then a lot of that pinch hit risk goes away. But assuming they go with their normal lineup against lefties, do keep that in mind, especially assuming that they are popular. It makes mini stacks appealing because there's a pretty good chance that you'll have, a lot of Tyler O'Neill, for example, will be mixed into people's 5-man Boston stacks. But if they have like Ref Snyder with O'Neill, then you can get an advantage on them by just having O'Neill without Ref Snyder, for example. So pay a lot of attention to the Red Sox lineup. There is likely to be a lot of pinch hit risk here. That being said, they are likely to be popular. They project really well. All of that is true. But again, the projected lineup I used has the lefties in. I did that yesterday as well. Hamilton ended up not playing. Smith ended up not playing. Abreu ended up not playing. So this is how it would look if they went with the lineup that I would like them to. But they probably actually won't go with that lineup. So you'll end up getting like some of this Hamilton ownership going to Westbrook. You'll get some of the Smith ownership going to Ref Snyder. So just be really cautious of the right-handed platoon bats for the Red Sox. But it is obviously a very good spot in Coors Field going up against Ty Blach. On the other side, the Rockies not getting as much ownership. And that's not surprising given that they are the Rockies instead of the Red Sox. But they are still in Coors Field. Criswell hasn't given up a lot of power this year. 167 expected ISO to righties, 206 actual. A lot of that can probably be explained by pitching his home games in Fenway Park. 134 expected ISO to left-handed hitters. So it's not like it sets up as a great matchup for the Rockies, but you are getting a relatively low-owned team in Coors Field. That's never a bad spot to be getting to. Stephen Leibowitz said Hamilton, Abreu, and Smith all got in. Yeah, I went back and looked at that after the game yesterday, and everybody that we expected to get pinch hit for did get pinch hit for. Some of them, like Westbrook, just happened to get it done before they were pinch hit for. Also, Stephen Leibowitz said Kenley Jansen not with the team. He said he'd had to have his heart shocked like 4 different times after pitching in Coors Field, so he didn't make the trip this time, which is wild that it took 4 times. But he's not with the Red Sox, so the back end of their bullpen is a little bit weaker. That's another. It's not something that is like super actionable. I'm not like manually bumping the Rockies projections or anything, but there's a little bit of add-on potential when you just don't have Kenley Jansen in this bullpen as well. Houston taking on Oakland after laying an egg against Hogan Harris yesterday. Spencer Arrighetti also very disappointing yesterday. Jake Bloss pitching for Houston. Oswaldo Oviedo for the A's. I don't really have interest in pitching here. Obligatory mention that the A's strike out a lot, but they do also have power. They have actually been above average from a production standpoint against right-handed pitching this year. I don't have a ton of interest in getting the Bloss. He's getting 6% ownership, 9% chance of being optimal. He's just somebody where, if you're playing 50 lineups, 100 lineups, 150 lineups, he might land in a lineup here or there, but he's not somebody I would expect to be prioritizing or be getting in, 3 max or anything like that. Offensively, I think you can make a case for either of these teams. The park isn't good for home runs, but there is a lot of power in this game. Houston looks like the more preferred stack given, their talent level, but I'm never opposed to getting to Oakland either. They just have a really, really high upside that isn't completely the median projections for Oakland just don't really tell the whole story. They don't tell the whole story for anybody, but Oakland is just such a weird team where they have a lot of guys that strike out a ton and don't really hit for a lot of average, but they just hit the ball hard whenever they hit it and they do a lot of damage. We've seen this team repeatedly win slates this year by just throwing up, 12, 13, 14, 15 runs when they're clicking, they all just hit the ball hard. So I'm always interested in them, especially against an unproven pitcher in Bloss at low ownership. But Houston does look like the bigger priority here. Yordan Alvarez getting 7% ownership looks perfectly fine to me. Diaz is cheap. Bregman is cheap. Singleton is cheap. Laperfido, Dubon, Myers, whoever's in the lineup out of those guys are cheap. Makes it easy to get to Altuve and Alvarez, who are the only two expensive guys here. So the park isn't very good, but Houston does have one of the higher implied run totals on the slate. I'm perfectly fine going back to them today. And then again with Oakland, much lower probability team, but they do just give you a really high ceiling, given the amount of power that they have in their lineup. Again, the park not good for home runs, so that does hurt. Speaking of parks that are not good for home runs, we once again have the Angels in Seattle, arguably the best pitcher's park in baseball. Jose Soriano pitching for the Angels, Logan Gilbert for the Mariners. Both of these pitchers look very good to me. I'm very surprised that Logan Gilbert isn't showing up more than he is for me right now. Jose Soriano looks like a priority as far as value plays go. $7,600 price tag, 17% projected ownership. Showed up as optimal around 20% of the time for me. He is a perfectly decent pitcher. 20% K percentage, 3.91 xFIP this year. The reason he's getting so much ownership here is that, for one, the Mariners have the highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching in baseball this year. I turned that game on at one point in, I think, the 8th inning yesterday in time to see Jorge Polanco strike out for the Mariners' 13th strikeout of that game. They strike out constantly. And then this park just limits power. It's hard to score runs. Really good pitcher's park. Really good strikeout matchup. Completely serviceable, competent pitcher in Soriano at a fair price tag. I understand why he's getting the ownership. I am surprised that Gilbert isn't showing up more for me, just given that he does have a good matchup here as well. He obviously gets that same great park that is benefiting Soriano. 24.8% K percentage, 3.45 xFIP. I think it's mostly a salary thing. Like, we saw Chris Sale not showing up nearly as much as the field for me. We saw Zach Wheeler showing up at like half the field. We see Gilbert showing up a little under half the field. He's another pitcher that I think as we get closer to lock, this number just increases. And I probably think that Gilbert looks at least a little bit better by the time we get to lock than I do right now in the numbers. Just from a analysis standpoint, ignoring that he only showed up as optimal 10% of the time, I do like this matchup for him going against the Angels. They are better against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching. They rank 13th in K percentage against right-handed pitching so far this year. They also only have an 89 WRC plus on their active roster. So if you can afford Logan Gilbert, by all means, Jose Soriano just looks like a good value. Offensively, I wouldn't anticipate getting to too much of this game. The Mariners do give you power at cheap price tags, but this park is just so difficult for scoring runs. You have 10 other stadiums that you can take hitters in. We have Colorado, we have Kansas City, we have Texas, we have Dodger Stadium. We have Atlanta, Toronto, Yankee Stadium. There's a lot of good hitters parks on this slate that makes it even more difficult to justify getting to a lot of Seattle. That being said, you do have the potential for a really solid value play in Victor Robles. He was incredibly popular yesterday, way more popular than he should have been. So that will be something to keep an eye on. But if he starts in center field in place of Julio Rodriguez again today, it just makes it less likely that he gets pinch hit for later in the game. The Mariners do have other guys that could play center, but Robles is who they would like out there if it's not Rodriguez. So if you do get that situation, he is relatively likely to play the entire game. He is very, very cheap. He is relatively likely to be hitting toward the top of the lineup. So that is a potential value play. Cal Raleigh, 4,800, getting a little bit more expensive, but he is always one of your highest upside catchers. And his salary does factor in that he plays in Seattle, since that's where he plays his home games. So Seattle doesn't look great, but I do think Robles has the potential to be a really good value option. I think Riley is always in play at catcher. The Angels don't look particularly good to me at all. Substantial park downgrade, really tough matchup against Gilbert. And then finally, we go to Dodger Stadium, another good hitter's park, as I mentioned a second ago. For the Dodgers, we have Landon Knack. For the Giants, we have Jordan Hicks. Neither pitcher getting ownership. Neither one really should. Obviously, a very, very difficult matchup for Jordan Hicks going up against the Dodgers. Landon Knack, 8K, just a tough price tag to want to pay for him. So far in the major leagues, limited sample for Knack, but he has struck out 22.6% of hitters, 4.21 xFIP. Jordan Hicks, so far this season, you have seen a decrease in strikeout percentage for him as expected moving into the starting rotation. 20.3% K percentage, 4.15 xFIP. Just two kind of middle-of-the-road pitchers in a good hitter's park. Much more difficult matchup for Hicks than for Knack, but I am more interested in the offenses than the pitching here because of the park. You get a nice park upgrade for the Giants. Neither team is showing up a lot as far as stacking goes. The Dodgers, same issue as always with getting to them as stacks. The players that you really want are really expensive and difficult to combine together, especially when you can see we haven't had a lot of good value pitching that we wanted to get to on this slate. So you have that, but then also the bottom of their lineup comes with one, not being very good necessarily, and two, a lot of pinch hit risk. You'll probably have like Gavin Lux or Outman or both or something like that in this lineup against Hicks. But then later in the game, if the Giants bring in a left-handed reliever, they're turning into, Chris Taylor or Vargas or whoever is on the bench in this game. So that's the problem with stacking the Dodgers. Shohei Ohtani individually obviously is a great play. He always is. Freddie Freeman, a good play. Will Smith, if you can afford them. But those are the issues with the Dodgers as a stack that kind of drives down how often I think you can get to them. For the Giants, they were disappointing yesterday. I got to them a bit. They are fairly priced. They do get a nice park upgrade. They do also come with pinch hit risk. Lamont Wade can very easily turn into Wilmer Flores later in the game. We saw Matos pinch hit for, I think it was Conforto in the 7th inning or so yesterday. The Giants are a team that can platoon, and they do it. But it is a little bit less risky when you're going up against a right-handed pitcher, since teams just have fewer left-handed relievers that they can use to match up with you. Whereas when you get a team like the Red Sox platooning against a left-handed pitcher, every bullpen has infinite right-handed pitchers they can bring in. And so it's a lot more pinch hit risk when you have platoon right-handed bats going against a lefty than when you have platoon left-handed bats going up against a right-handed starter. Yastrzemski, very affordable at $3,400. Chapman at $4,300, no pinch hit risk for him, and that's a good price. Mentioned Wade, good price, some pinch hit risk. Soler has a lot of power and gets a nice park upgrade, as does Ramos. So I think the Giants look like a completely serviceable middle-of-the-road stack. You can definitely build some high upside lineups around them, which is nice, but I wouldn't call them a priority. So to recap quickly, the top pitching on today's slate, Chris Sale, pretty clearly number one, even though he's not showing up as much for me as I think he will in my actual lineups. Soriano looks like your top value play. John Gray looks like a good value as well, but I am concerned about exactly how deep into the game he's going to work. Zach Wheeler, Logan Gilbert, I like both of them as pay-up options. Also, offensively, top stacks looking like the Red Sox, but again, be very cautious of their lineup and the pinch hit risk for their righties. Yankees, I like Tampa Bay quite a bit from a salary standpoint. Same goes for Milwaukee. Arizona looks good. There's a lot of stacks that look pretty comparable once you get beyond like the Red Sox and the Yankees. And then finally, for home run picks, I remembered to actually update my home run sheet today. Aaron Judge is at the top, which is kind of a no-brainer. I'm not going to count him. Jorge Soler coming in second for me. He grades out very, very well in, let me double check this, but he grades out really well in my pitch type, pitch location model going up against Knack. He gets the park upgrade. Jorge Soler is my home run pick as far as, guys that aren't named Aaron Judge. So that's all I have for you for this show. Thanks again for checking it out. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Endgame Syndicate, and I'll be back at 5 p.m. Eastern with a closer strategy look at DraftKings tournaments in particular. Thanks again. Have a good rest of your afternoon.